Now we're going to talk about open source software, talk a little bit about licenses, where it came from, relationship to free software, not the same thing as open source, and a little bit about where DoD is at in this, which is still an evolving thing. We start with Richard Stallman back in 1983, where he said, "So that I can continue to use computers without dishonor, I've decided to put together a sufficient body of free software so I'll be able to get along without any software that is not free." Now, I won't comment on what he means by without dishonor, but he strongly believes and has great conviction that software should not cost money, that we should be making money, companies should be making money supporting software. They should make it better so they'll have more customers that they can support, but that the software itself should not cost anything, which is an interesting twist on the economic issues that we talked about earlier in the course, because it would certainly put them to bed because there wouldn't be money to be made there. But Richard Stallman is the father of the free software movement, which is not to be confused with open source. So, but GNU comes along in '83. He writes the GNU Manifesto, which you can look up yourself. The GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. He leaves the MIT Media Lab in 1984. In 1985, GNU becomes basically functional. Now, the most important part here is what we call the copy left. Now, this is interesting because if you write a novel and you copyright it, the copyright legally protects the rights of the author. That is the language that is in the copyright. Copy left is really fascinating because it legally protects everybody but the author. It protects the rights of those who use the product. So you think about this in terms of software. The copy left was one of the very early steps in the development of open source licensing, because open source licenses protect the users, not the people who write new things. So that's why you want to use that. You take an open source product and you put an open source license on top of it, and you are protecting your rights to use it and the rights of people who use your thing to take what you've got and do what open source allows you to do. And the Free Software Foundation comes up and says, remember, free is not the same thing as open, although it's very important to think about when we talk about freedom in software, we're really talking about freedom in the sense of the freedom to choose, not free as in no cost. And that's a very important distinction. In the sense that we're talking about the freedom to choose and to adapt, free software is very much in line with open source. In the sense that it is free of cost, it may not be. So they're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. And you'll actually see them kind of lumped together. You'll hear things called FOSS, F-O-S-S, which stands for free and open source software. But free software is a matter of the user's freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software. So the freedoms include the freedom to run the program for any purpose, that's freedom 0. The freedom to study how the program works, that is, look at the source code. Now, I don't just give it to you and say, hey, you can use this for free. I actually give you the source code. You can see how it actually works. This is going to come up a little bit later when we talk about IA issues as they apply to open source, which in one sense scares people, in another sense really shouldn't. So you want to be able to access the source code as a precondition for this. Then freedom number 2 is the freedom to redistribute copies so that you can help your neighbor. So you can take the software, you can give it away for free. I don't have to ask anybody. I can also adapt it and give it away for free. But that's the next one, is the freedom to improve the program. I can release my improvements to the public so that the whole community benefits. And I, of course, have to have access to the source code for that. The GNU General Public License is the thing you're most familiar with. And here's the versioning. The most recent things come out in about 2005 is version 3. I'm not going to get into too many details on the differences between the licenses, but I do want to comment on the difference between pure GNU and the LGPL, which is the lesser GNU public license. GNU is what we call purely viral. So anything, if something has the GNU license on it, and you use it, incorporate it into your program is open source. You cannot deny others access if you're following the license, and let's admit that some people don't. But if you're following the license, your software has got to be open as well. The lesser GPL allows derivatives of an open product to have a lesser distribution. So it allows greater flexibility. This is why lots of folks are choosing the lesser GPL, and then there's others like the Mozilla license and some others that are similar to that, that give great freedom to people. The Berkeley Unix license, for example, and some of the others are extremely flexible. When you take software that has that license on it, you can almost do anything with it. You can distribute it for free if you want to. You can incorporate it into a for-profit product if you want to. There's great flexibility in that. But just know that they are not the same, although they all are called open source. Not every open source license has the same provisions. And next we come to the Cathedral and the Bazaar. I'll make the actual essay called the Cathedral and the Bazaar available to you, but it's actually this book, which is on your recommended but not required reading list, written by Eric Raymond, where Microsoft is the metaphor is Microsoft is the cathedral and open source is the bazaar, and he really this is the essay to read if you really want to understand what was the thinking behind open source, what makes it unique, what makes it different from centrally managed software, which Microsoft actually is. But lots of other companies are too, so let's not pick on Microsoft for that. But highly recommend that you read that essay. It really is enlightening on the roots of OSS and why people believe in it so passionately. Next came the open source label, followed the Cathedral and the Bazaar. Netscape open sourced the Netscape platform. There was a February 1998 strategy session where they said it was time to dump the moralizing and confrontational attitude that had been associated with quote-unquote free software in the past and sell the idea strictly on the same pragmatic business case grounds that had motivated Netscape. So major corporation, remember at this point Netscape is a huge player in software, and they're open sourcing their product. That was an extremely important step forward. People really took notice. And so we've already talked a little bit about the different sides of open source versus free software. If you can't tell who these people are, the person on the right is Stallman, and the person on the left is Linus Torvalds of Linux fame. And these are just two different ways of thinking about this. And again, they're not exactly the same. In fact, there's some friction points between the two. Stallman's view is, in a sense, fairly radical, that he really means free in every possible way, versus open source. The true open source movement allows for a certain level of compromise on a number of those issues, which, frankly, industry was demanding. So in the same time frame, about 1998, is where you get the founding of the real founding of the open source initiative. So you'll see OSI in many places, where the open source label comes up and the open source definition, which I will give to you momentarily. And here's the official criterion for open source. So don't call your stuff open source unless you meet these criterion. Free redistribution. So you have to be able to, you put it on the internet, people can download it and take it for free. You have to make the source code available. You have to allow some flavor of derived works. You have to allow for the integrity of the author's source code. There can be no discrimination against persons or groups. I can't say if you're a member of a certain organization, you can't use my software. Anybody gets to use it. Same thing against the different fields of endeavor. There's also the distribution of the license itself. When you start an open source project and you attach a license to it, the license goes with it. The license must not be specific to an actual product. The license must not restrict other software, and the license must be technology neutral. So you can't put out an open source product and say, this is just going to run on Windows. It may just run on Windows, but your license isn't going to block somebody who wants to port it to Linux or Mac OS or something else. So that's important to keep in mind. So you may have heard of the famous Halloween documents. This was an internal Microsoft memo leaked around the same time. 1998 was a big year for open source. And the famous quote is, OSS poses a direct short-term revenue and platform threat to Microsoft, particularly in the server space, where they determined that Microsoft must target a process rather than a company. Remember, Microsoft in the past, we talked earlier about the friction between Microsoft and Sun Microsystems, the friction between Microsoft and Oracle, and Microsoft and Apple, other companies, and all of a sudden Microsoft found itself challenged by something that wasn't even a company. It was a process. It was an ideal, and they really struggled with how to attack that ideal. Still are dealing with it today. It's not clear how Microsoft is ever going to really deal with open source. And if you look at the penetration of open source products, particular in that server space, think about the ubiquity of the Apache web server, for example. Way more common than the Microsoft web server software. You think about the simple SMTP for mail. You think about Samba for SMB, the ability to put Unix boxes on the same network with Microsoft file servers and share files. These are all products that are literally everywhere. Everybody uses them. Many of you probably use these products, you don't even realize you're using them. That's how ubiquitous they are. So even if you think you're not an OSS person, understand that it's underneath the fabric of what it is we do now. And you may use proprietary software. I use a lot of Apple products. You may use a lot of Microsoft products. It doesn't matter. Both of us are using a lot of open source products. So now we're going to talk about the actual licenses. There's the Apache license, which just means that it originated with Apache. It doesn't mean that it's bound to Apache. The new and simplified BSD license is the Berkeley license I mentioned before. There's the GPL, the GNU General Public License, that's viral, that's purely viral. The lesser GPL, which is not so viral. MIT license, not viral. Mozilla Public License, not viral. And then some others. A couple other things are missing here. First of all is public domain. Public domain is essentially no license, so when you put your software out on the internet and you don't put any license on it at all, somebody could technically take your software, pull it into a proprietary product that they sell, and make money with your source code. But for a lot of cases, who cares? That's fine. People are fine with that. There's another thing. You'll see technically open source licenses that are bound to specific companies. Now those worry me. When I look in a quote-unquote open source license and see the name of Disney Corporation or somebody else's corporation inside of it, it worries me. I need to read it very carefully and make sure that they're not somehow preserving rights for themselves that are outside of the domain of what we just talked about as the requirements for open source. So just something to keep in mind. When you see that something is open source, pay attention to the license. Give the license 5 minutes of your attention to look through it. What license are they actually using? Skim over it before you make any sort of a decision, especially a big money decision. Be careful. Look at it and make sure that it really is the type of open source product that you want. And one of the things that you need to think about is the open source development model. You learned when we talked about software development and software engineering, lots of different development models, the waterfall, the spiral, the V. Open source can't really follow any of those exactly because, remember, it's not top-down development. It's not a team of people and they're getting together and talking about what they're going to do next. It's sort of a volunteer network sort of a thing. So what happens is, let's use Linux as an example. There's websites you can go to and you can find out what sorts of things the Linux community has decided they'd really like to see done with Linux for the next release. Could be drivers for some hardware, could be some new features in the desktop environment, whatever. All sorts of projects. And if you would like to work on one of those, you can say, hey, I want to work on this, and you write your code, so you become sort of a developer. You stick around long enough and they get to know you, you'll become a trusted developer. Then you will upload that stuff into your code into a trusted repository, where it can be looked at by other people in the community. Bug reports come back in, improvements can be made. It eventually ends up in some kind of a distribution. So have you noticed that by the time you get an update to Linux, it kind of feels like an update to Windows or something. It's not like some little thing, it's an actual release, just like real software. Well, that's because there's actually a management group on top of it, still open source, but it's made it, all that source code has been made it through all these steps and been tested and everything, and then it's ready for distribution, and then users will get their hands on it. So a couple of other things to point out here is that people worry about security with open source. And one of the knocks about open source is, well, anybody can see the code, so God only knows what could possibly be in there. First of all, if some malicious hacker is writing code underneath Linux, you realize how many sets of eyeballs it has to get through, even just that little bit of code has to go through before it can actually do anybody any harm. It's got to go through a lot. There's great scrutiny that it has to make it through. Secondly, because there's so many people involved, that the minute somebody identifies a problem with a bug in Linux, it's fixed like within hours, because we're not waiting for some big release. Somebody says, "Oh, hey, I found this loophole. I found a bug in some sort of an overflow buffer. Oh, I'll just fix that." And they write the code. It gets tested real quick. They'll release a patch, and away you go. You're done. So it has its advantages, and a lot of the criticisms of open source really aren't valid. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's better or worse. I'm not going to be a cathedral or a bazaar guy, but I am going to tell you that some of the criticisms of open source are really unwarranted. Let's just accept the fact that the cathedral is not the bazaar, and the bazaar is not the cathedral, and maybe both of them have their place and their strengths. And the next question that comes up is, how are people going to be making money with this? While the software is free, there's got to be a way to make money, because money is going to keep people employed, going to keep them working on it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's a number of different things. There's Eric Raymond points out, why don't you sell support, not for the software, not the software itself, which is exactly what Red Hat did. If you remember our discussion on business models earlier on, that was one of the models we talked about. Sell support, don't sell the software. Another one is use OSS as a loss leader. So give away an open source product, and maybe you sell a product that somehow complements the open source product, but your product is proprietary. So people can buy the open source, get the open source product for nothing, and then if they want the extra features that you provide, they'll pay you some money, and you can have that. There's something called widget frosting, which is sort of widget frosting has to do with hardware, and the OSS makes it easier to get your driver support for your hardware products. IBM bundles the Apache server with their internet server hardware, things like that. And then there's accessorize, so selling books on it, selling bundled installers, all kinds of other things that leverage the popularity of that open source product in order to make money. So another thing, a few more ways that people are making money with OSS is use the open source product to enable revenue producing services. So now it's not just the service on top of the open source. What if the open source is actually driving your revenue generating service? So you have some service that uses software, and you just happen to be leveraging open source software for the service that you provide. If it's a financial service or what have you, you can leverage that. Then there's sell it, then free it. We see this a lot in game companies are doing this, where they'll sink lots of money into their game engines and keep it proprietary and use it to develop a number of games. And then when they're ready to move on, and they've got the next major revision of their game engine, they make that proprietary and they open source the old one. So that happens fairly often. There's also build a brand and license it, so that's something that works. You can also franchise the software. Just in the same way that Microsoft could open source Windows, you could sell franchises to sell Windows, specific niche markets for mobile devices or particular industries like medical practices or accounting firms or what have you. You could have franchises for each of those. Now we come to OSS and the Department of Defense. I believe this document that you're looking at here is in our repository for you to take a look at. But this has gotten a lot of attention, mainly because it was so badly misunderstood initially and people feared it. And open source was not at one point even really allowed to be considered. And that has completely flipped around to where now it essentially is you are required to consider open source alternatives, just like you would consider any other alternative. If you recall, we talked about analysis of alternatives in procurement, making sure that you've done your market survey and you know all the different ways that you could provide this capability. Well, now if there's an open source way of doing it, you have to report on it and give it a fair consideration. So lots of different of aspects of open source are in this report. The cybersecurity community was actually very upset about the prospect of free and open source being banned for some of the reasons that we had talked about before. At this point, we get into something a little bit deeper, because now we're not just talking about open source, we're talking about open systems, and the government really bit into this in a big way. In fact, there was a fairly major OSD program that was specific about open systems, extraordinarily successful in hardware. The NAVC, for example, had an open systems initiative where they basically published interfaces to how different pieces of equipment would plug together so that they could work better with their vendors. Huge step forward, really great stuff. We should actually be able to learn more from it from software, even though a lot of the ideas came from software. But there's a couple of competing interests here. We want to provide for the defense of the United States, so we want to have the very best products, but we also want to support and grow the U.S. industrial base. That means opening up the possibilities for small business, small, medium-sized business. This was all good for them. We don't enable the internal distribution of already paid for software, so there isn't anything like some sort of a clearinghouse for things the government has already paid for. We do find ourselves locked into obsolete proprietary technology, so we want to get out of that. If you know what SourceForge is, or that's a clearinghouse for open source software, there have been several attempts at doing something like that for government software. So let's say GOTS software, the government has paid for, but we don't want to make it completely open source, but we want to share it within the government. So some really great ideas came out of that. And software has become so central to the mission of the warfighter that it's just everywhere anyway. So the idea to bring open source on a level playing field with other types of software was just a very necessary thing to do. And what the result of this actually was that we ended up having increased technological agility. Now you've got more choices, and just the fact that that the decision makers had software products available to them that specifically avoided the types of lock-in that we were sort of forced into for years, changed the nature of the business for proprietary software too, not just open. And that was a really great thing. So this has had a positive impact even in cases where we don't use open source software. So you end up with a more robust and competitive options for program managers, and certainly a higher level of accountability for the defense industrial base. There was no more of this, well, I just built my thing and I got it in your program and you're just really not going to ask me any questions because I can pretty much do whatever I want. Options became available. And as we're learning about in this course, we can do an awful lot better than what we're doing right now. But I just want you to understand that the open source movement has had an extraordinarily, in my view, positive effect on the Department of Defense, even in cases where we don't use open source. So this just gives you a quick snapshot of the different sorts of things that the open technology has been looking at. So certainly open standards and interfaces, what I was talking about, where this is not just software interfaces, they're hardware interfaces, but also open source software and the design of software, a collaborative, a distributive culture, online support tools, technological agility. These are all things that have come out of the OTD program. A few interesting points here is what we saw initially was open source would come out because people didn't trust it. We were actually funding industry to essentially replicate. Remember, there's licenses on top of this, so you can't just blatantly steal it because it would have to be open too. But there's no reason why I can't give you an open source product and say, I'd like a product just like this but not open, so just rebuild it in a proprietary sense. But that's really not the point. And what Boyd is saying here is, look, we should be leveraging this, not trying to replace it. And a lot of the opportunities here, certainly IT, pervasive, lots of infrastructure, communications technologies. Think about all the satellite and radio communications that we do. Advanced geospatial infrastructure. That's just everywhere. Open source is everywhere today. And then there's that term technological agility again as a metric, and it's tricky now how you're actually going to turn that into a number. But the idea here is that by using open source, if it gains you flexibility, that's got to be a good thing. So again, from the government's point of view, what are some advantages? Encourages software reuse. When we talk about architecture, we're going to try and take that to another level entirely. But it's the first most obvious step. Instead of having proprietary software that you want to reuse in lots of cases, but gee, if it doesn't quite fit exactly what I wanted, I can't really make it work, why not just give the source code away? That's got to increase software reuse. I want to increase code quality and security. Some people say, well, geez, you're opening it. Well, that's going to increase it? Yeah, it is. In fact, we've demonstrated it many times that code quality and security go up when you open a product. Subject to scrutiny with many eyes. We already talked about that. You want to decrease vendor lock-in, but you learned a lot about lock-in, and this is only one facet of lock-in. So don't think that you've gotten rid of lock-in just because you've gone to an open source product. In fact, in some ways, I've often said that pure open source has many of the same drawbacks that that proprietary software has. It's just open, so it's got an advantage, but it didn't get rid of everything. We want to reduce the cost of acquisition, absolutely. We want to increase customizability, absolutely. And meritocratic community. You want to have people who are contributing to that code base, and there's some sort of a meritocracy in doing so. So now specifically talking about open source software now, not just open systems, a few things are interesting here where we talk about the reasons why the government would use or create open source in acquisition. First of all, the use of it. So we can use it for anything. So we have no restrictions on us whatsoever. Study. We can evaluate a program in detail, which lowers our risk, and it's good for the program managers. Remember, you can go to a level of study with open source that you'll never go in with proprietary software because you can't see the code. Modify. I can modify for special needs, and I can adjust something on the fly if I want to with open source. I might not be able to do that with proprietary. And then redistribute. I can copy repeatedly. I can lower the total cost of ownership, which is a big buzzword in DoD today. The support may have per use cost, but that I can compete that sort of a thing. So there's a lot of potential uses and a lot of reasons why the government is paying so much attention to open source today. Now the main thing I want to show you here is that one of the sticking points with OSS and the government up until now, and I think we're really getting past this now, is that it just wasn't understood. We talked about the security issues, the code quality issues. There were common assumptions, and this is why having program managers in the government who have a reasonable technical working background so that they understand these things. A typical MOVE student really understands why, because they've written code, why open source might be advantageous for certain reasons. Somebody who has not written source code might not understand that quite as well. So they're not able to ask the right questions, therefore there's fear of the unknown. Let's not use it. We're getting past that now. We're definitely getting past that now. So it is a fundamentally different economic model. Get that through your head. It is a fundamentally different economic model when you go down open source. The business models are different. The way money flows is different. And if you're going to use open source as a program manager, you got to understand it very clearly. You got to be able to work with your acquisition, your purchasing folks, your contracts folks, because it's going to be a little different than business as usual. And some perceived challenges that you're likely to hear when you say you want to use open source in government. The number one thing I hear is support. Who's going to answer the phone when my program doesn't work? When I buy a Microsoft product, I like to know that there's a 1-800 number. I can get a guy on the phone, and it's his job to make sure that this thing works. That's okay. What I've seen happening a lot in government is I've seen organizations for less money than it costs to buy big software actually stand up their own small support team. So they have their own people on contract, etc., who are their support arm. There are businesses that are already in place to support open source products. Red Hat's a good example, right? So Red Hat produces that's an open source product, but you can put a contract in with them and they will pick up the phone and answer your Linux problems. So there are different ways of getting around the support issue, but I think that's the number one problem that I hear about. We hear a little bit about license compliance. People are afraid of the different licenses and what restrictions they might place. And again, this is a little bit of an ignorance thing that we often don't understand the different licenses. And also classification code. What if I want to use an open source product, but I'm going to actually put it into a classified, it's going to end up in a classified system. I can't open source my classified system. And again, there's a little bit of a lack of understanding too, and a lack of the ability to architect, because any software architect worth his mettle is going to know how to build a system that has to have a classification in such a way that the classified component can be separated off from the unclassified part. Now, to wrap up this open source module, these are the real take-homes. There's really two types of commercial off-the-shelf software. There's proprietary and open source. Those are really the only two categories. Interesting that one of my personal mantras is that I hate the thought that I have to choose between proprietary and open source. And what I mean by that is when I'm developing a system, I don't want to have to make a choice at a top level that I'm going to go open source or proprietary, because frankly there are a lot of reasons why I may want both of those things. I like to think of open source as the commodity level stuff, the things that I really should not have to pay for because they've been implemented so many times in so many different places. Why am I paying money for it? But I want to bring software specialists in, and they should rightfully be selling proprietary software because they're specialists, and just complement my open source architecture with proprietary software. So I want to be able to mix those two. When we get into architecture, you're going to see how we can do that. One of the things you want to know is that open source options should, or really they will, always be considered. So even if you decide you're not going to use open source, you're pretty much required to at least explain why you're not going to use it. But open source is not always the best choice. Keep that in mind. There's a lot of cases, there's reasons why you want to use proprietary software. So again, go back to my first point of why I want to mix and match. I do not want to have to make a choice between the two. I want to be able to architect a system that allows me to have both. You got to be able to negotiate with parties and select one, whether it's open source or proprietary. There's a lot of education left to do with program managers about the differences in open source, the different licenses, the pros and cons, the differences between OSS and proprietary. We've got a lot of educating to do. We still have more to do. And the big take-home is the last bullet. You must develop an open architecture to enable later change. That doesn't matter whether you're using proprietary or open source. open architecture is the most important thing that you're ever going to do, not open source. I can live without open source as long as I have an open architecture. That's the number one thing. We're going to come back to that when we talk about architecture. So there's quite a few references I'll leave you with here. A bunch of these I will have in our resources folder on our website. But of course, many volumes have been written on open source itself. Not all of which I personally agree with, but there's a lot of information out there. There's really no excuse for not understanding open source and what it can do for you. Well, that wraps up our open source software module. We've got a couple more things we're going to touch on with regard to software before we move into some other topics.